For most of human history, combat was a desperately intimate act. Survival depended entirely on closing the physical gap between yourself and your enemy. You had to stand close enough to smell another person's breath, feel their body heat, and absorb the physical resistance of their flesh against yours. The primary technology of this era was aggressively manual. Weapons like this hand-chipped stone axe required the wielder to generate all necessary kinetic energy themselves. The battlefield was a chaotic environment of absolute sensory overload. It was defined by intense physical exhaustion, desperate screams, and the immediate, terrifying reality of a threat standing inches away from your face. Taking a life in this first domain of war meant crossing the most intimate physical threshold. You had to truly know your victim in their final moments. This level of proximity carried a massive psychological burden. Humans possess a natural empathetic response. Taking a life at arm's length severely traumatizes the survivor. To engage in sustained hand-to-hand violence, ancient warriors had to overcome an immense mental barrier, forcing themselves past deeply ingrained biological inhibitions against killing a member of their own species. Looking at this spatial graphic, we can define the historical kill zone for this era. It measures a strict 0 to 2 feet. There is exactly 0 space between combatants. This level of physical and emotional intensity has a clear exhaustion point. Combatants could only sustain this sensory overwhelm of close-quarters combat for short bursts, forcing frequent pauses in the action as the mental toll became unbearable. Humanity's subsequent military innovations were driven by an urgent need to mitigate this overwhelming emotional burden. We needed a way to fight that didn't require us to feel the enemy's pulse. The Roman Empire engineered a solution. They shifted the nature of combat from solitary tribal skirmishes into a highly disciplined, systemized process. The tool designed for this mechanized approach was the Roman Gladius, a short sword housed in a black and gold scabbard. The design of the Gladius favors a specific, repetitive motion, the short, stabbing thrust. Behind a wall of shields, a soldier could deliver the strike with mechanical consistency, minimizing exposure to the enemy. The breathless, chaotic screams of primal skirmishes were replaced by the organized, grinding, rhythmic sound of marching boots and striking iron. By replacing frantic survival instincts with strict, unfeeling procedure, the Romans engineered a highly effective workaround for the psychological trauma of intimate combat. To make this system work, soldiers underwent brutal psychological conditioning designed to completely strip away their individual survival instincts and personal agency. This abstract diagram illustrates the result. A chaotic, dispersed swarm of individual fighters reorganizes into a rigid, impenetrable grid formation. By acting as a single mechanism, this structure distributes the emotional weight of killing across the unit, lessening the individual burden. Yet, a major limitation remained. The system successfully altered the psychology of the fighter, but the physical distance between the killer and the killed was still measured in inches. The Roman system erased the individual, but the soldiers still had to look their victim in the eye. That persisting intimacy created a strong demand for a weapon capable of truly separating the two. The medieval wooden crossbow represents the technological leap that finally solved the problem of combat intimacy. By ratcheting a crank to draw the string back and lock it into place, the weapon outsourced the required kinetic energy to a mechanical device rather than relying strictly on human muscle. This trajectory graphic shows a changing spatial geometry of violence. The kill zone moves from arm's length to over 100 feet, creating a physical gap. This extended trajectory severs the sensory connection. The shooter no longer hears breath or feels the strike against bone. By outsourcing the kinetic strike to a machine, humanity carved an emotional void into the battlefield, severing the terrible intimacy of combat. The introduction of the crossbow set a technological precedent. Successive military innovations prioritized one primary metric: the physical distance between combatants. Black powder and artillery industrialized this concept. Massive cannons, securely positioned behind fortified sandbags, allowed armies to tear apart formations from across entire fields. For centuries, nations entered wars expecting a theater of individual glory. The battlefield was perceived as a stage for heroism, defined by bright uniforms, disciplined cavalry charges, and personal acts of courage. The onset of the Industrial Revolution broke this illusion. Mass manufacturing replaced the artisan's touch with standardized mechanical output. Weapons were no longer muskets crafted by individuals. Factories produced rifles with identical structural geometry, utilizing precision-milled parts that increased both accuracy and the volume of fire. This technological shift had immediate consequences. Lethal line-of-sight firing ranges expanded from dozens of paces to hundreds of yards. Traditional tight formation marching resulted in mass casualties before an enemy was even visible. The battlefield functioned as the terminus of a brutal industrial supply chain. Manufacturing millions of weapons created a massive logistical demand. Nations required the capacity to transport millions of men to the front lines to operate them. The steam locomotive met this need. Driven by churning steel wheels and coal smoke, trains acted as a conveyor belt, moving a generation of soldiers directly to the front at speeds that bypassed traditional constraints of geography. Simultaneously, the telegraph brought instant communication to the field. Central commands used it to synchronize troop movements and coordinate strikes over vast distances. Military leadership adapted accordingly. Generals spent less time on maneuvers in the field and more time managing train schedules, telegraph lines, and supply quotas from remote headquarters. In this new environment, success depended on the arithmetic of mass transit and industrial deployment rather than individual tactical maneuvers. By World War I, the industrial output of entire nations was concentrated into the physical theater of the war. The Maxim machine gun functioned as an automated harvester. Its continuous mechanical feed allowed it to mathematically counter mass infantry charges, neutralizing waves of men with rhythmic precision. Heavy artillery increased the distance further. Operators, dwarfed by the scale of the machinery, destroyed targets from miles away without ever seeing a human face. To sustain this bombardment, domestic factories operated continuously, producing the endless rows of identical shells required to keep the guns firing. The front line had become a mirror of the factory floor, a system designed to process and destroy human material with mechanized efficiency. This automated fire created a stalemate. To survive the mathematics of the machine gun, armies were forced to dig into the earth. Trapped in the mud of the trenches, the individual soldier was left in a state of utter helplessness, unable to rely on traditional combat skills under a continuous barrage. When physical barriers held, militaries turned to industrial chemistry. They engineered heavy waves of poison gas to roll over the trenches and bypass physical cover. Poison gas forced men to hide behind rubber and glass. This stripped away individual identity, turning soldiers into faceless subjects of a chemical process. In this conflict, the laws of industrial physics and chemistry dictated the outcome, leaving no room for human negotiation. Escaping the static slaughter of the trenches required humanity to encase itself in moving steel. The first armored tanks were engineered for blunt force. Their heavy, riveted tracks crushed barbed wire and deflected machine gun fire that had previously halted advancements. Above the mud, the internal combustion engine allowed aviation to take flight. This expanded the geometry of the battlefield vertically, creating a threat that could strike from the sky. Breaking the trench deadlock required the soldier to integrate fully with the machine. The internal combustion engine expanded the physical boundaries of the battlefield. This graph tracks the physical distance between combatants over time. For most of history, warfare required standing close enough to physically strike an enemy, keeping the kill distance minimal. But with heavy artillery and aircraft, that line spikes upward. The limitation of sight was removed. These early mechanized beasts set the trajectory for our modern era, leading directly to autonomous drones executing strikes from the stratosphere. The Industrial Revolution shifted the outcome of war from the individual agency of the soldier to the output capacity of the factory. Progress was no longer measured in acts of valor, but in the relentless efficiency of the machine. The static, muddy trenches of the First World War eventually dried out, replaced by a battlefield reorganized for mechanical momentum. Armies stopped digging in and started moving, building a massive, synchronized organism defined by speed. High above the Earth, engineers broke the sound barrier. Supersonic aviation meant destruction could be delivered across continents in hours, forcing war onto a planetary schedule. This new velocity required rebuilt reflexes. Pilots made decisions in seconds, pushing human biology to its threshold. Down on Earth, velocity integrated infantry into the machine. Soldiers ran alongside armored vehicles, acting as a rolling wall of armor. Directing them relied on chaotic, human-led coordination, a storm of radio networks, where commanders synced thousands of moving parts in real time. Despite the massive reach of these machines, the soldier remained a physical presence on the field. They occupied the same space as the enemy, breathing the exhaust and feeling the direct shockwaves of the kinetic clash. This era represented the limits of what a physical human could coordinate in a high-speed charge. But just as armies were mastering this mechanical symphony, a new threat was rising that changed the scale of conflict entirely: the atom. The atomic bomb introduced a paradox. Destructive power had grown so great that the old model of large-scale, physical battlefield collisions was suddenly a liability. This map shows the logic of mutually assured destruction. If one side launched, the other would retaliate immediately, blanketing the planet in fire. It froze the world's superpowers in a state of permanent, terrified waiting. Because the surface was now a target, the front line shifted into deeply buried, claustrophobic concrete structures. Fluorescent-lit isolation replaced the noise of the charge. Fighting meant sitting in a quiet room, waiting to push a button. This reality leaked into civilian life. Isolated concrete shelters appeared in open fields, forcing the public to acknowledge that total annihilation was a constant possibility. With open war a death sentence, conflict moved to the shadows, becoming a proxy war of clandestine operations and the invisible threat of chemical subversion. By making the open field unsustainable, technology began to sever the physical connection between combatants, replacing the kinetic clash with a silent, distant standoff. In the late 20th century, the standoff evolved. The physical frontline was increasingly replaced by a digital surveillance network that never blinked. This Maxar satellite view shows the level of detail available from orbital platforms. Hostile terrain is mapped flawlessly from space, allowing for a level of reconnaissance that makes hiding an encampment nearly impossible. On the ground level, human sight was technologically extended. Devices were built to capture ambient light, stripping away the natural concealment of darkness. Even behind physical cover, the human body remains visible. This thermal scan shows how biological heat signatures turn individuals into glowing beacons, tracked through walls and in total shadow. By forcing visual data out of the shadows, technology stripped away the cover once provided by distance and darkness. This massive reduction in uncertainty created a new gap between the observer and the observed. Today, the trigger is pulled from the opposite side of the planet. Operators manage lethal strikes from air-conditioned rooms. This creates profound psychological distance. The person delivering force is shielded from the environment, seeing results only as data on a screen. Contrast this quiet control room with the violent velocity of a munition diving toward its target at hundreds of miles per hour. We are now entering a phase where the human eyes on the screen are no longer even necessary. Autonomous machines, like this robotic platform, can use algorithmic targeting to hunt and identify targets without a remote operator. As the distance between combatants becomes effectively infinite and algorithms learn to interpret the target for us, it raises a question about the nature of our wars. When the human is fully removed from the theater of combat, what or who is actually fighting? Look out across the open ocean, and you see a featureless void. There are no hills to hide behind, no trenches to dig, no forests for cover. Surviving out here means dominating the surface. Because the sea is so vast, ancient naval combat was ironically intimate. To defeat an enemy, you had to get uncomfortably close. You had to cross the open water and fight at zero distance. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, Greek commanders relied on sheer physical momentum. They propelled their heavy, bronze-clad galleys across the water to ram and shatter the timber hulls of the opposing fleet. but treating your entire ship as a weapon is a precarious strategy. A high-speed collision guarantees massive structural damage to both vessels, risking the survival of the very fleet you need to project power. To effectively control the seas, navies had to solve a basic geometric problem. They needed to expand the kill zone, finding a way to destroy the enemy without physically crashing into them. By the age of sail, commanders had their solution. Wind-powered warships evolved into massive floating artillery fortresses, carrying dozens of heavy cannons stacked across multiple decks. This required a rigid new tactical geometry. At Trafalgar, fleets arranged themselves into precise linear formations, the line of battle. Sailing nose to tail maximized the firing angles for their heavy guns. When these lines engaged, commanders unleashed the broadside. Synchronized line-of-sight cannon blasts from dozens of guns at once would systematically obliterate the timber and structural integrity of an enemy hull. These heavily armed fleets also allowed nations to choke off trade. By parking a wall of cannons outside a harbor, navies could enforce a blockade, strangling an enemy economy without firing a single kinetic shot. The lethality of the warship now extended from point-blank range out to the visible horizon. Yet, to sink an enemy, a captain still needed direct visual contact. That geometric limitation broke entirely with the introduction of naval aviation. Aircraft carriers stretched the battle space hundreds of miles past the curvature of the Earth. During the Battle of Midway, carrier strike groups fought an entire engagement without the surface fleets ever seeing each other. Dive bombers and torpedo planes navigated heavy anti-aircraft flak to strike vessels entirely over the horizon. Simultaneously, commanders pushed the battle space downward. Submarines turned the flat surface board of the ocean into a three-dimensional hunting ground. Operating in stealth, submarine wolf packs hunted merchant convoys. Relying on unguided torpedo runs, they systematically severed the global supply lines that kept war efforts alive. By mastering both the sky and the deep, fleets removed the strict requirement of line of sight. The ocean had become an invisible, over-the-horizon grid of destruction. The cold calculus of modern sea combat arrived during the Falklands War. Anti-ship missiles proved that a single, precise strike could compromise the structural integrity of an entire modern warship. Today, combat reaction times are compressed into seconds. A supersonic weapon skimming just feet above the waves, triggered by a distant radar blip, leaves a crew with almost no time to respond. This 3D diagram shows how modern fleets survive. They project an area denial threat bubble around themselves, mapping incoming low-altitude vectors and launching overlapping layers of electronic countermeasures and automated interceptors. Navies use this localized sea dominance to project power straight onto land. Amphibious assault elements push onto the beach under the protective umbrella of over-the-horizon fire support. Yet the apex predator of this environment operates entirely detached from the surface chaos. The nuclear submarine glides continuously through the deep, acting as a silent, global strategic deterrent. The warship has evolved from a wooden battering ram to a stealth missile node, but the absolute truth of the Leviathan remains what it was in the ancient world. Global supremacy requires total mastery over the featureless, unforgiving sea.
For millennia, the horizon ended where Earth met sea. The sky remained an untouched, silent void, a space where human violence could not reach. That silence broke during the First World War. In the early days, pilots took to the air to scout enemy movements, often waving to their counterparts in the opposing trenches as they passed through the clouds. These machines were fragile, wood frames and stretched canvas held together by wire. They were eyes in the sky, transmitting the exact locations of ground troops to heavy artillery batteries. When it became clear that a single pilot could direct a lethal artillery barrage on 1,000 men, the waving stopped. Handguns were drawn, then came rifles, and finally heavy machine guns synchronized to fire through the blur of a spinning propeller. By the end of the conflict, the air was no longer a sanctuary. It was the primary vantage point. If a commander lost control of the sky, his soldiers in the mud were blind, exposed, and defenseless.
World War II replaced the individual duels of WW1 with the sheer industrial volume of mass destruction. Formations of B-24 Liberators could carry thousands of pounds of explosives across oceans, targeting the infrastructure that fueled the enemy's war machine. Defending against these swarms required interceptors, specialized fighters designed to climb thousands of feet in minutes and shred bombers before they reached their targets. The P-38 Lightning was engineered for this high-altitude hunt, featuring twin engines for speed and a heavy concentration of nose-mounted cannons. As planes flew faster and in larger numbers, the human eye became the weak link. Ground spotters could no longer detect an incoming swarm early enough to launch their defenders. This oscilloscope shows the radio echoes of objects hundreds of miles away. It allowed a single technician to see through thick cloud cover and total darkness. Aerial combat transitioned into a mathematical exercise. The sky became a digital grid, where survival depended on interpreting data before the enemy appeared in person. The jet engine pushed aircraft towards the speed of sound, creating friction and forces that traditional airframes could not withstand. These F-84 Thunderjets show the radical shift in aerodynamics. Sleeker bodies and swept wings, designed to survive the intense pressures of supersonic flight. At these speeds, human reflexes failed. Pilots often crossed paths too quickly to track a target or aim a fixed gun with any accuracy. Guided missiles removed the need for manual aim, adjusting their own flight paths to pursue targets through high-speed maneuvers. Engagement ranges expanded to 50 miles, beyond visual range combat, where the first indication of an enemy is just a warning light. Modern pilots rely on algorithmic certainty. They secure sensor locks from miles away and fire, ending fights before ever seeing the other aircraft. Ground defenses eventually evolved into automated grids of radar and missiles, turning the sky into a lethal, networked wall of fire. These missile batteries can track dozens of targets simultaneously, launching supersonic projectiles that are almost impossible for a standard aircraft to outrun. If an aircraft cannot outfly these sensors, it must bypass them. Modern doctrine shifted from flying faster to becoming invisible. The F-117 Nighthawk uses these jagged, flat panels to deflect radar waves away from the receiver. It is designed to appear as small as a bird on a defensive screen. The B-2 Spirit extends this capability to global ranges. Its curved, wing-like shape allows it to fly deep into guarded territory to deliver its payload without appearing on any radar network. The pilots who once waved to each other have been replaced by the architects of these unseen predators. The sky remains the ultimate domain of conflict, an environment where the side that owns the heavens dictates the fate of the earth below. The most destructive weapon of the modern era was carried into its target on a standard USB drive. For decades, state-sponsored hacking was confined to intelligence gathering. Operatives broke into networks to copy classified data, remaining invisible and leaving the physical world untouched. That boundary dissolved with the emergence of code engineered to manipulate physical hardware. This software was designed to force industrial machines to tear themselves apart from the inside. This crossover meant that silicon-based systems were now as vulnerable to attrition as physical supply lines or fuel depots. Operation Olympic Games targeted Natanz, a fortified Iranian nuclear facility buried under concrete and disconnected from the internet. To bypass these defenses, the Stuxnet worm was smuggled inside, bridging the air gap. Once inside, it silently replicated from terminal to terminal. For the engineers in the control room, everything looked completely fine. Stuxnet intercepted the monitoring software, feeding the human operators looped, normal telemetry data. But down on the facility floor, the reality was violently different. The malicious code commanded the massive steel uranium centrifuges to accelerate wildly, pushing them far beyond their design limits until the metal warped and snapped. Nearly 1,000 calibrated industrial cylinders were wrecked. Operators were left staring at the debris of their own hardware, dismantled by an invisible force. A fortified target was destroyed without a single soldier crossing a border or firing a shot. The concept was proven, and state actors around the world immediately took notice. The methods deployed at Natanz could not be contained to a single operation. Once intelligence agencies demonstrated that code could cause kinetic damage, rival state actors began engineering their own hostile software. This led to the deployment of NotPetya and WannaCry. Unlike the highly precise strike on a specific nuclear facility, these were military-grade cyberweapons released recklessly into the open internet. They were built as self-replicating digital contagions. Once introduced to a network, the software hunted for vulnerabilities and spread instantly from system to system, requiring no human interaction to execute its payload. The code behaved like a biological virus escaping a laboratory, propagating through the global network at speeds that overwhelmed standard security protocols. Global supply chains collapsed almost immediately. The internal networks of international shipping conglomerates like Maersk were infected, leaving thousands of immense cargo cranes frozen dead against the sky. Ships were unable to dock or unload. Trucking depots backed up. A digital lock applied to corporate servers entirely halted the physical movement of the world's goods across multiple continents. The collateral damage quickly reached civilian safety. Entire hospital networks were caught in the crossfire as their systems locked down simultaneously, rendering patient records and scheduling systems completely inaccessible. The disruption extended straight into operating rooms. Life-saving medical monitors went dark without warning, forcing surgical teams to halt procedures mid-incision. These strikes against the logistical veins of civilian life caused financial and logistical disruptions that exceeded the damage of many physical bombing campaigns. The chaos caused by NotPetya taught advanced state hacking groups like Fancy Bear and Volt Typhoon a critical lesson. Mass, uncontrolled disruption triggers international backlash and risks severe retaliation. They shifted their doctrine to a strategy called pre-positioning. Instead of launching immediate, noisy attacks, these units quietly embed their code deep inside adversary networks and sit entirely dormant. The SolarWinds breach demonstrated how an attacker can leverage a single, trusted point of failure to compromise thousands of high-value targets at once. Hackers managed to poison a routine, trusted software update sent out to SolarWinds clients. When network administrators installed the patch, they unknowingly pulled malicious code right through their own firewalls, granting attackers access to thousands of classified government and corporate databases. Hostile state actors have transitioned into a state of permanent, invisible occupation inside our critical systems. This silent infiltration has already trickled down to the municipal level. Sleeper code has been identified sitting inactive inside the software that manages our domestic water filtration plants and local utilities. It is actively embedded within the digital systems that govern electrical transmission towers, quietly logging the flow of power to millions of homes and businesses. These digital weapons are not destroying anything right now. They are simply waiting in the dark, positioned and ready for a single geopolitical command to detonate. When that keystroke happens, the result will be a cascading, unpreventable blackout, plunging entire regions into total darkness. The ordnance of the next global conflict is already in place. Every connected device now sits on the modern front line. Above the protection of our atmosphere lies a geographic blind spot. In this vacuum, hundreds of miles overhead, the sensors and communication nodes that modern nations rely on drift in exposed, predictable paths. Modern military operations depend on this orbital layer for encrypted communication and millisecond-accurate timing. If these assets are removed, a ground force loses its ability to synchronize maneuvers or strike targets beyond the physical horizon, effectively blinding the command structure before a terrestrial battle even begins. This reliance has led to the development of direct ascent anti-satellite interceptors, ground-launched missiles designed for a single purpose: high-altitude intersection. This map plots the physics required for a successful strike. To hit a target moving at 17,000 miles per hour, the interceptor must follow a precise ballistic arc that places it directly in the satellite's path at the exact moment of crossing. After clearing the atmosphere, the multi-stage booster falls away. The remaining kill vehicle uses its own onboard thrusters and thermal sensors to lock on to the heat signature of the target against the cold background of space. The destruction is achieved through pure collision. At these velocities, the impact of the kill vehicle's mass is enough to instantly shatter the satellite into thousands of fragments without the need for an explosive warhead. These kinetic strikes are effective, but they are also messy. Each successful hit creates an expanding cloud of high-speed debris that remains in orbit for decades, threatening every other satellite in that altitude, regardless of who owns them. To bypass the risk of creating permanent debris fields, military strategy has shifted toward non-kinetic methods that neutralize a satellite's function while leaving its physical frame intact. This high-energy laser facility is built to generate coherent light beams with enough power to reach into low Earth orbit. Rather than destroying the hull, it targets the most sensitive part of the asset, its optics. This display shows the predictable nature of reconnaissance. Ground stations can calculate exactly when an enemy asset will pass directly over the facility. Unlike a missile, a directed energy beam travels at the speed of light. The intercept is instantaneous. This is the dazzle effect. The focused energy is so intense that it permanently melts the delicate lens coatings and imaging sensors inside the satellite, rendering its cameras useless, while the rest of the spacecraft continues to orbit, unharmed. Blinding a satellite achieves the same strategic goal as a missile strike. The adversary can no longer see the battlefield. But because the satellite remains in one piece, there is no debris, and often no immediate proof that an attack even occurred. Space-to-space warfare takes place entirely within the vacuum, moving away from ground-based launches toward a more subtle form of engagement. The most difficult tactic to detect is the co-orbital creep, exemplified by Russia's Matryoshka program, a system designed to hide an offensive capability inside a harmless-looking shell. As this diagram illustrates, a seemingly commercial heavy-lift satellite maneuvers until its orbit matches a target GPS node. By syncing their speeds perfectly, the two objects appear to be a single, non-threatening point on ground-based radar. Once in position, the outer shell separates. It reveals a hidden hunter satellite, shielded from detection during the entire launch and approach phase. The nesting doll effect continues. The hunter satellite then ejects a third, much smaller microsatellite. This killer craft is highly maneuverable and small enough to evade most automated proximity sensors. This microsatellite uses small mechanical arms to physically sever antennas or wires. It can also deploy a localized charge to disable the target's electronics without causing a large explosion. In orbit, proximity is a weapon. By the time a ground controller notices a mechanical failure, the attacker has already drifted away, leaving the malfunction to look like a random hardware glitch. The ultimate technological shift in space control is the deployment of directed energy weapons directly into orbit, removing the interference of the Earth's atmosphere entirely. Space-based chemical lasers provide a surgical strike capability. These are not weapons of mass destruction, but tools of extreme precision. This thermal overlay shows the laser's effect. By focusing a beam on a specific component, like a maneuvering fuel line, the weapon can burn through the metal in seconds. Once the fuel line is severed, the satellite loses its ability to maintain its orbit or change its orientation. It becomes a drifting, useless hulk, neutralized with absolute accuracy and zero physical debris. While lasers target individuals, high-power microwave weapons are designed to deny access to entire regions of space simultaneously. A ground-based 20-gigawatt microwave array requires a massive footprint. This scale of power is necessary to project a concentrated electrogram shows the wave's reach. As the invisible pulse washes over a cluster of satellites, it induces massive electrical currents in every conductive surface it touches. Inside the satellites, delicate processors and memory units violently overload. The sudden surge of energy melts internal circuitry and permanently destroys the satellite's brain in a fraction of a second. The result is the total loss of an entire constellation. The hulls remain intact, but the network itself, the data links and the positioning signals, simply vanishes. When these orbital nodes go dark, the high-speed data and precise navigation that define modern military power are severed. In the strategic void, a nation's global reach can be restricted to the physical horizon by a single invisible pulse, leaving its most advanced forces disconnected and blind.
In the spring of 1915, a heavy, yellow-green fog began bleeding across the fields of Ypres. It didn't arrive with the scream of a shell. It simply rolled over the lip of the trenches, a heavy, silent vapor clinging to the mud. Chlorine gas reacts with the moisture in the human lung to create hydrochloric acid. For the unprepared soldiers caught in the cloud,
the sensation was a literal drowning from the inside out. Survival depended on primitive innovation. Men soaked rags in water, or their own urine, and strapped them over their faces with goggles, attempting to filter the air before it reached their lungs. But the early masters of chemical warfare faced a strategic paradox. By releasing a weapon into the atmosphere, they surrendered it to the weather. A shifting wind could push a lethal cloud back into the faces of the very men who launched it. These agents proved that a single deployment could inflict thousands of casualties. They also introduced a permanent variable of chaos, a weapon that terrorized the field but could not be steered. To bypass the unpredictability of chemicals, military science looked toward living organisms. By the mid-20th century, researchers began isolating naturally occurring pathogens like anthrax and the plague for direct weaponization. During the Cold War, the focus shifted to industrial volume. Massive covert facilities were constructed to cultivate these agents on a factory scale, ensuring a stockpile of biological threats to match the nuclear arsenals. These stockpiles were built for mass effect. A single gram of weapons-grade anthrax contains enough spores to infect millions, with no mechanism to distinguish between a combatant and a civilian. The architects of these weapons worked in total physical isolation. They operated in pressurized suits and sealed chambers, perpetually connected to external air supplies to avoid the very plagues they were perfecting. Despite global efforts to ban these programs, the underlying risk remained constant. Any large-scale release threatened a chain of contagion that could not be contained by any border. Modern technology has moved beyond the discovery of natural diseases. We now have the tools to rewrite the internal code of a pathogen, shaping its behavior at the genetic level. This introduces the theory of the genomic weapon. Imagine a synthetic virus drifting through a population, searching for a specific genetic sequence. The pathogen remains dormant until it detects a predetermined DNA marker. It acts as a biological lock and key, activating only when it identifies its intended target. Biosecurity intelligence now focuses on digital footprints. Hostile sequences can be stored as code within global genetic databases, hidden as strings of data until they are synthesized. If the theory of genomic targeting holds, it offers a solution to the century-old problem of blowback. A hostile actor could deploy an invisible agent with the surgical precision of a targeted strike. A century ago, the terror of chemical warfare was visual. You could stand in a trench and watch the air itself turn into a threat. Genomic targeting moves that boundary inside the cell. It proposes a future where our own genetic markers, the very code of our identity, serve as the triggers for our destruction. The target is no longer the soldier in the trench, but the civilian in the city. Populations are vulnerable to an agent that leaves infrastructure standing while selecting victims with microscopic accuracy. There is no alarm and no visible cloud. The weapon is engineered to wait within the body, silent and undetectable, until it finds the match it was built to kill. The quest to master the architecture of invisible death has come full circle. We have not gained control over the weapon. We have simply written the threat into the code of life itself. In the final years of World War II, a sprawling, highly classified race played out in the high desert laboratory of Los Alamos. Driven by the fear that Axis scientists would crack the physics first, the Manhattan Project gathered the world's brightest minds to harness atomic energy in total secrecy. The theoretical math quickly gave way to a terrifying reality. By splitting a heavy nucleus, scientists found they could initiate a rapid, uncontrollable fission chain reaction, releasing millions of times more energy than conventional explosives. In August 1945, that theoretical physics was weaponized over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The towering radioactive plumes confirmed that humanity had successfully engineered the absolute weapon. The devastation on the ground was absolute. Entire city grids, centuries of built infrastructure, and tens of thousands of lives were completely erased in a fraction of a second, leaving only scorched plains in their wake. Beyond the immediate military victory, the project successfully harnessed the same forces that power the stars. For the first time, scientists and leaders possessed the direct mechanism for human extinction, a reality they had to reconcile with immediately, and the knowledge could never be uninvented. Humanity was trapped in a paradox. From that point forward, international survival would depend entirely on the persistent, looming threat of global annihilation. This chart illustrates the rapid technological escalation. Early fission bombs were measured in kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT. But within a decade, the US and Soviets developed thermonuclear fusion devices measured in megatons, yields exponentially more destructive than what was dropped on Japan. Looking at this map, you can see the architecture required to deliver these new yields. It's called the nuclear triad, a globe-spanning delivery system designed to ensure a nation could launch a strike from anywhere on Earth at a moment's notice. The air leg relied on long-range strategic bombers. These aircraft could be placed on continuous airborne alert, providing a highly visible deterrent and the crucial ability to recall a strike right up until the final moments. Meanwhile, the land-based leg utilized heavily fortified underground silos housing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. These offered immediate, high-yield retaliation that could cross the planet in under 30 minutes. The triad ensured that no preemptive strike could ever fully eliminate a nation's ability to retaliate. By distributing the arsenal across air, land, and sea, the superpowers locked themselves in a permanent, inescapable standoff. This flowchart maps out the grim logic that supposedly kept the peace: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It is the simple guarantee that any attack initiates an inevitable sequence, ending in the total destruction of both the attacker and the defender. Within that framework, targeting doctrines split. The counterforce strategy prioritized striking enemy military assets and silos to degrade their ability to retaliate. Conversely, the counter-value strategy targeted population centers, relying on the sheer punitive horror of civilian casualties to stop an attack from ever happening. Pushing these doctrines to the edge brought the world to the brink of disaster, most notably during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba nearly turned a geopolitical dispute into a planetary execution. The burden of this game theory fell directly on the crews staffing the command centers. Maintaining hair-trigger readiness meant living with launch-on-warning protocols. When radar glitches and false alarms inevitably occurred, those isolated personnel had just minutes to decide if civilization was about to end. And still, the arsenal expanded. The invention of MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, allowed a single missile to splinter into a swarm of warheads falling from space. Intercepting a barrage of that scale was a physical impossibility. The Cold War's perceived stability relied on a high-risk gamble. A single radar glitch or a misunderstood military exercise could have initiated a launch sequence before either side realized it was a mistake. With the dissolution of the INF Treaty and the abandonment of the Open Skies Agreement, the structural guardrails that managed the Cold War have eroded. This vacuum and the entry of new nuclear powers has transformed the global balance into a complex, multipolar landscape. To gain an edge, nations are engineering next-generation delivery systems specifically designed to bypass the early warning radar networks built in the 20th century. Hypersonic glide vehicles operate in this space. They travel at extreme Mach speeds, but unlike traditional ICBMs on a predictable ballistic arc, they can maneuver rapidly through the upper atmosphere, slipping past modern defense grids before a response can be organized. The threat extends deep underwater as well. Russia has developed the Poseidon, an autonomous, nuclear-armed submarine drone. It is engineered to cross entire oceans undetected and detonate just off a coastline, burying major naval bases and cities beneath a highly radioactive tsunami. In the air, the Burevestnik is an experimental Russian cruise missile powered by a miniaturized nuclear reactor. With a limitless power source, it can theoretically stay airborne indefinitely, flying circuitous, unpredictable routes around the globe to strike from completely undefended angles. By stripping away the flight time and predictability that once allowed for stable deterrence, these systems remove the psychological buffer that previously prevented a launch. They create an environment where an attack can reach its target before a defender even realizes they are under threat. The escalation ladder remains in place, but it is now built on a taller cliff. Today, global survival remains entirely dependent on the fragile, high-stakes psychology of deterrence, a balance that cannot afford a single error. Modern multi-domain operations rely on a specific connective tissue of radio frequencies, GPS signals, and digital encryption. Under current conditions, electronic warfare units can now actively locate, jam, and sever these classical networks in real time. Quantum information science introduces new physical constraints that negate the core assumptions of current defensive systems. This shift moves the strategic battle space away from the domination of continuous waves in the electromagnetic spectrum. Instead, it focuses on the manipulation of discrete subatomic particles existing in multiple overlapping states. This estimate evaluates the specific vulnerabilities now facing the three pillars of modern military power: GPS-based precision, low observable stealth, and public key cryptography. The following analysis is divided into three functional domains: sensing and metrology, communications, and computing. Achieving a strategic advantage in this environment requires a doctrine based on the manipulation of quantum states rather than classical electromagnetic signals. In a contested battle space, external signals are often jammed or spoofed. In these conditions, a platform's ability to navigate is tied to the reliability of its external data links. Here is alternative PNT. Left, an open-loop GPS receiver intercepted by jamming. Right, a closed-loop quantum gravimeter operates internally. It measures local gravity variations, matching readings to internal maps for driftless navigation, remaining completely unaffected by jamming or satellite loss. This sensitivity to physical mass and gravity also allows for a new approach to stealth detection, particularly in subsurface naval operations. This topographical view shows the Earth's constant magnetic field lines. To track targets across the seafloor, navies use superconducting quantum interference devices, or SQUIDs. Moving a massive metal submarine hull through water warps local magnetic field lines. SQUIDs detect these specific distortions. Acoustic silencing only traps sound waves. It cannot mask the physical magnetic interaction between the vessel and the Earth, rendering traditional stealth ineffective here. Similar principles apply to airborne stealth when evaluating the feasibility of quantum radar and LiDAR. Classical stealth uses specialized paint and angles to deflect or absorb radio waves. Quantum radar uses entangled photons. If a photon strikes a target, its entangled partner instantly registers the contact, completely bypassing radar-absorbent coatings or geometric deflection. In this domain, physical presence in space guarantees detection. If a platform exists, it interacts with quantum fields, allowing it to be targeted without regard for classical cloaking. Command and control networks currently rely on mathematical complexity for security. This means a network is only secure as long as an adversary lacks the processing power to solve the underlying math. Quantum key distribution, or QKD, moves away from math-based security toward a system grounded in the physical laws of nature. Here, a photon stream encodes a cryptographic key. Under the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, observing a quantum state changes it. If an adversary attempts interception, the act of observation forces the photons out of their original state, permanently altering the data's geometric shape. This alteration collapses the data and provides an immediate alert to both the sender and receiver, identifying the exact moment of the interception attempt. While secure, scaling this into a global quantum internet requires a significant investment in physical hardware. Because quantum states are fragile, transmitting them over long distances requires space-based entanglement nodes positioned in orbit to relay signals across the globe. On the ground, terrestrial distribution requires specialized fiber optic quantum repeaters placed at specific intervals to maintain the integrity of the signal. This architecture shifts the point of failure. While the data itself is secure from hacking, the hardware required to transmit it is exposed. Orbital satellites and terrestrial repeater nodes remain susceptible to kinetic strikes, anti-satellite weapons, and directed energy attacks. Deploying QKD networks requires a reallocation of resources to defend these physical nodes, as the vulnerability moves from the digital code to the physical infrastructure. Beyond transmission, we must address the processing of data and the threat of quantum cryptanalysis. This server farm represents a strategy known as store now, decrypt later. Adversaries are currently intercepting and archiving encrypted military data, waiting for the hardware necessary to break the encryption. The tool for this retrospective decryption is Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm factors massive prime numbers with high efficiency. In a quantum environment, it shatters the RSA and ECC public key infrastructure that protects modern communications. This creates an immediate requirement for defense architectures to transition to post-quantum cryptography standards before quantum hardware is fully realized. Quantum computing also provides significant advantages in theater-level operational support. This visualization shows a quantum algorithm optimizing supply chain routes in real time. As new threats appear, the system processes millions of variables to reroute logistics instantly through contested space. Commanders can use this power to run battlefield simulations that test millions of operational permutations simultaneously, providing a level of foresight not possible with classical computers. In material science, quantum processors simulate molecular structures with high precision. These simulations accelerate the discovery of new energetic materials, advanced armor plates, and metamaterials for next-generation stealth applications. Control of this domain provides a definitive advantage in the allocation of time and resources. Integrated, these three domains form a single kill chain. Quantum sensors locate targets by physical interaction, bypassing traditional cloaking. Targeting data routes through QKD networks, physically securing the link. Simultaneously, computing nodes optimize logistics to sustain the strike. In this environment, the legacy systems that define current superiority, classical stealth, math-based encryption, and external GPS, become liabilities. The shift to a post-quantum battlespace is not a distant concern for future planners. Deployed quantum gravimeters and the ongoing archiving of encrypted data make this an active intelligence reality. Surviving this shift requires an immediate overhaul of procurement and doctrine. The quantum strategic frontier has already been reached.
Throughout history, dominance relied on the physical control of territory. You seized the land, breached the walls, or utilized industrial-scale artillery to level infrastructure from a distance. Eventually, the physical battlefield expanded vertically into the skies. Air power and remote systems allowed for clinical, high-altitude strikes that separated the operator from the immediate consequences of the kill. Today, the arms race has moved inward. The latest theater of war has no geographic terrain. It exists in the sixth domain, human consciousness itself. The Kremlin's Unit 29155, an elite GRU psychological warfare team, has operationalized this frontier. Their primary tool is a system described in internal files as a quantum phone to the consciousness. This device utilizes quantum entanglement to establish an instantaneous, untraceable link to a target's biological systems. It monitors heart rate, brainwave activity, and emergent thoughts without requiring a single physical wire or local signal. Traditional borders and physical defenses offer no protection against an adversary that operates from inside the target's own mind. Once connected, the GRU begins a campaign of neurological disruption. They inject phantom noises, whispered threats, induced insomnia, and waves of nausea directly into the target's perception. The objective is to identify Russian expatriates with high technical value. If they can't be recruited as clandestine assets through this pressure, the operators escalate the biological assault to drive the target towards psychological collapse. This weapon functions with built-in tactical deniability. Because the symptoms perfectly mimic severe mental illness, medical professionals routinely dismiss the victims. When a target describes hearing voices or feeling remote physical pain, they are categorized as suffering from schizophrenic psychosis. The act of seeking help completes the siege. The institutional diagnosis discredits the target and achieves the GRU's ultimate goal of total social isolation. Case files for Target Zero reveal this process in action. Alexei Ivanov was a successful financial algorithm developer, living a comfortable, assimilated life in San Francisco. The GRU initiated the assault by weaponizing his forgotten heritage. During REM sleep, operators flooded his brain with engineered visions of a Russian childhood, forcing dormant linguistic pathways to reactivate against his will. The permanent quantum connection took a physical toll. Alexei experienced sustained artificial insomnia and biological stress that physicians misidentified as a standard mental breakdown. When Alexei attempted to warn U.S. intelligence agencies, he was met with institutional betrayal. He was placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold by the very system he tried to alert. The GRU playbook was executed. The target was physically brutalized,
chemically restrained, and stripped of credibility. But the weak point of this advanced technology is the human operator. Extended operations lead to fatigue, and fatigue leads to errors. This visualization shows a microscopic anomaly Alexei caught. The operator placed phonetic stress on the second syllable of an English word, a rhythmic error consistent with a native Russian speaker. This provided Alexei proof that the torment was an external, state-sponsored attack. Alexei used this discovery to transition from a target into an active combatant. He began cataloging every phoneme and frequency transmitted by the operators. He established a cognitive firewall to separate and categorize injected GRU data from his own thoughts, effectively treating the assault as malware to be isolated. Because the quantum link is bidirectional, Alexei began a counteroffensive. He fed truth viruses back through the connection, injecting facts about the program's failures into the GRU's own operational matrix. Intellectual discipline and hyper-attentive observation neutralized the psychological weapon. A single mind proved more resilient than the technology designed to rewrite it. A protocol error during the connection permanently locked the device to Alexei's frequency. Research suggests that this constant entanglement caused his brain to process information across a dendritic tree of future probability timelines. From this perspective, he identified a critical civilizational fork. He describes a future choice between dead worlds that are ruled by techno-totalitarianism and a united pan-federation focused on the stars. This scientific anomaly is why the program failed to break Target Zero. The GRU's models account for biological stress, but they could not account for a man whose core identity was anchored by faith and an absolute refusal to surrender his autonomy. The invasion of the human mind is not a theoretical threat. It is a global reality that has already begun. The GRU program demonstrates that even technology targeting our internal biology is powerless against a resilient human consciousness that refuses to be rewritten.